Analyst, as they always say. And it's Linda Bjerketvedt, who is she's the data analyst for Scotland's Rock Art project. She's been in the team since November, and she's very well experienced. She has an MSc in landscape archaeology from universities in Berlin, and she also studied at Edinburgh. And she's also very active in organisations such as the Landscape Research Group, and is a committee member for the CIFA Scottish Group. So we're very much looking forward to this session. She's going to talk about the landscape context of Scotland's rock art, which she's been working on very hard over the last few months. So Linda, take it away.
Thank you. Right, I'm just going to get the setup again. Can you see that? Yes.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. So I know we're all probably pretty knackered, so I'll try and keep it as short as I can, 20 minutes or so. I will be talking about the work I've been doing since I started last November. My role includes performing spatial and statistical analysis of the data in our database. And this is a pretty immense task, especially because we're working at multiple scales. So like Joanna was mentioning, from the national scale to the local level. And my talk, Carving a Place, Leaving a Mark, will look at what we've been doing to better understand the landscape context of rock art in Scotland. So, as our community teams are probably familiar with, rock art in Scotland is found in some very spectacular landscapes. The experience of visiting one of these rock art panels can be quite breathtaking, especially on a sunny day, I imagine. And rock art tends to be recorded in marginal areas of the landscape, like upland hillsides, open moorlands, and around the coasts. Many of these sites offer extensive views of the surrounding landscape, and in some cases they also appear along modern pathways. So it's not surprising that researchers started thinking about this relationship between carvings and their environment. And in fact, since the 1980s, rock art research has increasingly looked at the setting and context to better understand the meaning and role of prehistory. Alison Sheridan already picked up on Richard Bradley's work in her keynote, but just to return to his seminal work from 1997, he emphasized long-distance visibility and pathways as important facets of Atlantic rock art. Building on Tim Ingold's work, Bradley took this idea of territories defined by trails and views and incorporated rock art into this organization of the land. So in his theory, rock art could be considered a language of signs, expressed as boundary markers in association with paths that are leading through the landscape and certain places along their course. And Richard Bradley did inspire many researchers, and his ideas still continue to shape the rock art discourse. Since mobility and visibility are continuously emphasized in rock art research, we wanted to deconstruct these ideas and define them in a measurable way. So within the research questions defined by Joanna previously, we are looking firstly at some of the large-scale characteristics of rock art. This means employing descriptive statistics, which classifies and summarizes the data, for instance, through graphs and charts. Secondly, we want to understand how the environment affects the distribution of the rock art. So we want to determine groupings, clusters, and find correlation between variables. And lastly, and most tricky, as people have already mentioned throughout today, is to explore the role of the landscape in the creation of rock art, so the meaning. How does, for instance, rock art within the landscape relate to contemporary human activity? How may the movement across the landscape relate to rock art creation? And what does accessibility and visibility actually tell us about the role and meaning of rock art? So for the rest of this talk, I will present some of the case studies I have been working on and the methods I've used to deconstruct visibility. I have looked at visibility from different distances and several levels. So this is very much still research in progress, but we are seeing some interesting trends. Here is an overview of the case studies I have been working on so far. There are 7 in total, amounting to around 420 sites. So these are areas where the data collection had been concluded at the end of last year, and therefore they were ready for me to analyze. We will be expanding with further case studies, so we will include 2 further samples from Loch Tay, and we will also include areas around Dumfries and Galloway, Inverness and Aberdeenshire. We will also, of course, be looking at the entire scrap data set on a national basis, but this is our starting point for the methodology. One of the key things I have been focusing on is the environmental context of rock art. This means looking at certain variables, like the ones I've listed here. These can give us an insight into regional variation and characteristics. So for instance, soil type may give us clues about preservation and archaeological formation processes. If we look at acidic soils, for instance, they can accelerate the weathering of rock. Geology is another important factor because it tells us something about the medium of the carving, so something about softness and hardness and about particular properties of the rock itself that may have made it attractive. Peat depth is another thing that can be informative about discovery practices and surroundings. For example, in southwest Ireland, a lot of the rock art appears in open valleys of blanket peat. And there have also been cases in Ireland where rock art sites have been uncovered due to intentional peat cutting. Land use is another factor which can affect survival and destruction. So intensified agriculture, afforestation, and urbanization have all been shown to cause severe damage to panels, as also some of the speakers have demonstrated. Elevation is also something that we're looking at. It can contribute to the topographic prominence of a site. So there may have been, for instance, preferred patterns of altitude related to rock art location. It may also relate to visibility and wide-ranging vistas. And both slope and aspect, the angle and direction of the terrain, are 2 variables which again can tell us about the choice of location for rock art. Slope determines the type of activities that are viable to develop in specific areas. And by looking at all these parameters holistically, we are already getting a good sense of what characterizes the rock art. So to start off with one of my case studies, here I am in the Mid-Loch Tay group. It's around 47 rock art sites. A lot of the work I've been doing, I'm using GIS software. GIS stands for Geographic Information System, and it's a software that you can use to create, manage, and analyze spatial data. So the underlying base map of this map is a 5-meter digital elevation model, and already we can make some interpretations about visibility. Already from the map, I can read that the views are likely to be quite extensive along the lake, especially towards the southwest and to the south side of Loch Tay. The high elevation surrounding the loch could indicate also restriction in visibility towards certain directions. And these interpretations are also confirmed by fieldwork undertaken by the community teams. Here we are seeing a specific panel and the views towards the north, east, south, and west. And we see that the views to the south are definitely the most extensive, looking towards the flatter area of the north side of Loch Tay. Our views seem to be particularly restricted towards Ben Lowers in the north due to the slope and to the east due to the curve of the terrain. So already now you can kind of get a good feel for how this particular panel is situated in the landscape. But if you want to capture this visibility in a more objective and quantitative way, we can use a so-called viewshed analysis in GIS. A viewshed is essentially a calculation of the area that is visible from a location. You can modify the algorithms in a way that you, for instance, add observation height, target height, or a radius that limits the extent of this viewshed. So in this case, I have generated a single viewshed, which you can see in neon green, for the panel that we saw at the previous slide, marked with a blue square. This calculation gives us a tangible measure that can form the basis of further analysis interpretation. Using these kind of computational approaches are by no means meant to replace information gathered in the field, because subjective perceptions are really important for us to understand details not captured by a software. But it does, however, allow us to investigate subjects such as visibility from different angles. If you add all single viewsheds generated, say, for single points together, you get a so-called cumulative viewshed. The cumulative viewshed allows you to see how many sites or observers share the same area of visibility, which can help to decipher patterns of visibility. Here I have calculated it for the Kilmartin, Kilmickle, Glassery and Cairnban area in Argyll, which has 92 rock art sites in situ. We can see that the dark blue areas are seen by 5 or less sites, whereas yellow areas are seen by between 27 and 45 sites. So the areas of high visual prominence can indicate particularly important landmarks, which I will come back to in another case study. But from this image, we might derive that these sites are visually limited to the Kilmartin Glen, the Kilmickle Glen, and the Bog Glen to the south. There is also a handful of sites that exhibit vast areas of sea views, similar to what we heard about from Butte. To provide more detail, let's zoom in on the northern cluster, which I have marked with the red circle. Combining the different characteristics of a cluster with their visual relationship, can we begin to find similarities and differences? The map on the left shows the cluster I highlighted at a smaller scale and as blue squares. The cluster consists of 22 sites in situ, close to Carnassery. And looking at their placement in the landscape, alongside the elevation values, we can see that as a graph on the top right, there are some differences. So the elevation for this cluster spans between 45 and 154 meters above sea level. That's a difference of nearly 100 meters, which in terms of modern hiking standards is not considered a lot. The terrain slope at the locations of the rock art is now shown here as yellow and pink squares at a closer scale. We can see an even split in steepness between accentuated slopes, which can also be labeled as steep, and medium slopes, which are moderate. There is not a clear correlation between steepness of slope and elevation, which is not necessarily a surprise because high elevation does not always equate steep slope. It is clear that the panels are not located in the steepest parts of the terrain and neither in the tallest. So more importantly, one can deduct that even in a relatively small area like this, which is less than 4 square kilometers, and with a small group of 22 sites, there is a difference in the placement of the panels in the landscape when it comes to elevation and slope. In terms of the geology of this cluster, we can also see a great deal of variety in the bedrock. So the geology of the Kilmartin area is fairly complex for a relatively small area. The only geological factor that many of these panels have in common is that they were smoothed and polished by the glaciers, which results in a perfectly polished surface. Another characteristic is that almost a third of the rock art are on boulders or slabs that have been transported by glaciers from elsewhere. So these glacial erratics will usually be another geology than the surrounding area. There also seems to be a clear relationship between these panels and the use of natural features and panel edges, just like Joanna was mentioning previously. In the top left corner, the graph shows the different types of structural variants. So fissures, which are dividing or enclosing, are used at almost half of the panels. Natural depressions are also utilized alongside fissures, as well as the panel edge itself. This proves to show that perhaps when dealing with tougher rock panels, the carvers preferred to use existing natural features to organize the composition of motifs. And within this small cluster, the carvings in many ways follow a similar strategy. But how do these similarities and differences in landscape location and panel medium actually relate to visibility? I previously showed you the cumulative viewshed for the whole of the Kilmartin area, which included the northern cluster. And viewsheds do indicate areas of visibility going from a site, but it can be hard to capture the intervisibility. So a special plugin has been developed for QGIS, which is a free GIS software, which calculates precisely the intervisibility as a network of lines. Similar to when you're calculating a viewshed, you have to define a radius from the observation points, which acts as the boundary. And depending on how big you set the radius, say 500 meters versus a kilometer, you will get very different results. And the output will be a pair, which you can see as the graph on the left, a source and a target. If target X can be seen from source Y, there will be a line. And sometimes these pairs can be reciprocal, that is, they can be seen in both directions, but other times they're only visible in one direction. I have focused on 3 different ranges: 50 meters, 100 meters, and 500 meters. And these are distances that are based on previous studies of visual perception in the field. They correspond therefore with different levels of perception. Here I have calculated the intervisibility for the northern cluster of Kilmartin using a 500-meter radius and an observer height of 1.6 meters. 1.6 meters is considered to be an acceptable generic height for individuals in the past. And the count next to each site refers to how many times that panel is being seen by another panel. Now, the most striking observation is perhaps that the connection between the 4 panels in a row. The first one starts at the valley floor, and each is located at a slightly higher elevation until you reach the last panel, which is Carnassery Farm. There is almost a transition from the lowland area going up to the upland area. And I mentioned earlier how rock art has been associated with paths and boundary markers. Our cone of vision tends to be more limited when we are looking up a slope than when we are looking down a slope. And this is to do with the natural gradients of the terrain. If I am hiking, I tend to rely on path markers going up a hill than I am coming down a hill. So if I was coming down this particular slope, going from Carnassery Farm down to Crackantarragh, I would actually see the whole glen in front of me. This line does not indicate which direction the visibility points to, but a closer look at the pairs reveals that the visibility is actually moving down the slope. So Craigentarragh cannot see Carnassery Farm 11, but Carnassery Farm 11 can see Craigentarragh. And so forth up the hill. So this one directional line of sight could indicate a particular movement of visibility that are related to specific locations or activities. This line of sight is, however, not captured at 100 meters or 50-meter radius. These sites do not seem to have been intervisible at an intimate level, but perhaps they testify to another type of visual relationship. A closer look at these 4 rocks in the field shows that they are relatively flush with the ground, so they're between 20 centimeters and 60 centimeters. And despite being located in open air context, they almost appear tucked away. And all the panels except the last boulder was covered with turf and vegetation. This is significant because it impacts their visual prominence in the landscape. We can, for instance, speculate that if they were made to be seen from above, like I showed previously, what purpose does that serve, and is it significant? These are quite hard and impossible questions to answer, perhaps, but it does indicate that there's more to visibility than to be seen or to see. In terms of design and composition, the complexity also decreases when you're going from the valley floor up to the top boulder. So Craigentarragh is found on the valley floor. It contains at least 142 design elements. So this is a massive design composition. It is also heavily defined by the natural fissures that cracks and covers the panel surface. Next up, the Carnassery Farm 11 panel contains 26 cut marks, which are, again, divided between different natural fissures. So again, this is quite an intricate composition and interplay between features and motifs. Moving up the hill, you come to Carnassery Farm 11, which contains only 3 design elements, but their natural features are still part of the surface. And finally, the boulder at the top, Carnassery Farm, contains only 1 definite cut mark. So we are seeing a variation in landscape setting, we are seeing a variation in visibility, and also a variation in design, all within 4 panels located along a line of just over 1 kilometer. Moving to another case study briefly, I will focus on the area of Upper Glennie and Nether Glennie, which is an upland area, Stirlingshire. This area is quite densely populated with rock art panels, which you can see as red dots on the map to the left. There are 46 panels in situ. Most of these panels are outcrops and they have a friable surface, so that makes them quite easy to carve compared to the ones in Kilmartin. And the map on the left shows the cumulative viewsheds for all these sites. And there are 2 yellow areas on the maps, which are seen by a large part of the panels. I marked them in red. And looking at the landscape, these are actually very prominent landmarks. So to the west, we have the Craig of Monivrecchi, which is also visible in the back of Overglenny 12. You can see it at the bottom right photo. And to the east, there is also a long and narrow ridge that sticks out in the landscape. Again, you can see it from Netherglenny 12 on the top right photo. And the cumulative viewshed is prone to picking up these kind of hotspots because they are so visible by so many and from so far away. So there are also different levels of visibility within this group of panels that should be explored in more detail. The first map shows an intervisibility network with a 50-meter radius. There seems to be quite a few panels that are not connected visually to other sites in their immediate surroundings, but we do have a few tight clustered panels in the southwest and in the northeast. At 100-meter radius, they naturally become more connected visually, less panels sitting on their own, but we are still looking at isolated clusters. And finally, the 500-meter radius connects everything into a more general trend. So even in a dense cluster like this, one can still see a different organization of the panels within the landscape from a visual perspective. Some panels are very intimately connected and can be identified even at a very close range. Others are really isolated and visually removed. And the isolation of the southwestern cluster at a higher level also proves to show intricacies of visibility. So this example also shows the importance of scale when we are dealing with computational approaches. We need to be very mindful of how the results change depending on what scale, radius, size, etc. that we choose, because this has implications for how we now interpret the data and what conclusions we draw. So to wrap up, what I've presented today is very much still work in progress, but it definitely demonstrates the great potential of the scrap data that has been recorded by the community teams. We are looking at a number of variables, and the idea is to identify patterns of location and behavior and differences in these patterns as well. We have specifically focused on visibility and mobility, and I have presented the former here today because these are themes that are so dominant within rock art research. My deconstruction of visibility analysis showed how complicated it can be to determine relationships when we are trying to be mindful of scale at the same time. At the moment, we might not know what the symbols mean, but we do know that they were located in the open landscape. They were quite accessible. They were often created in groups and tend to be clustered. So it's not an isolated phenomenon, and this proximity between carvings is significant. Do they, for instance, demarcate economically important areas? Are they related to particular places of visibility? Or are we simply transposing some of our own current values to the past by overemphasizing visibility? So we are seeing some main characteristics shared across the whole region, but there are also, even at a very small level, nuances to these features. I have demonstrated the intricate and intimate nature of intervisibility and how, with these smaller case studies, there is so much variation. And to me, the choice of rock is intentional. There is something about that particular glacial boulder or that rock with natural features that makes it the chosen rock panel. Thank you so much. And here we have someone viewing the landscape.